So, how many of you know what is Elm or used it?
Never heard of it. I know what it means.
Half, yeah. So this is a very simple intro talk in which I'm just gonna explain why Elm, kinda this thing that everyone talks about, why, and that's about me. I work here at Reify Academy, and that's kind of the thing where I use Elm primarily. I teach, I do a lot of other strange stuff, and I like to live in Bali, not here. So, what's happening? So with the JavaScript, I've been developing JavaScript for about 6 years, and I'm finding it harder and harder to actually develop there, because we ended up in a situation where we have a lot of choice. Like when you're trying to figure out what do you want to use, which view library you want to use, you have 7 different libraries to choose from. Just considering the popular ones, you have at least 4. You have React, Angular, you have Vue.js, and some other hipster one I'm forgetting. And then you need to choose your state management library, unit testing library, and all of these libraries, which you end up wiring somehow together, and it's kind of ends up being a big mess. So there's actually some research on it in terms of buying in the supermarkets. So in the supermarkets, when you go, they don't have too much choice. They have a specific amount of choice, because what they've realized is if you give people too much choice, they just stand there and like, I don't know which one to buy. There's too many things, but that's the sweet spot where you want to be, where your ecosystem needs to be, so people have a bit of choice. I think Ruby on Rails is kind of there. They have a bit of choice, but not too much where you get overwhelmed with too many things. And with JavaScript, what happened recently is this. So this is NPM modules in the last year. So as you can see, every other module is just going slowly, climbing up, and NPM just went insane at some point. You cannot maintain the quality of modules either when you're developing at that many modules at the same time. So you end up in a zoo. You end up using a library, which then gets abandoned because the maintainer doesn't want to work on this anymore. He found some other cool project, and there's a lot of problems with approach like this. So there is quite a few frameworks in JavaScript which try to do functional programming, but what Elm did differently is they try to eliminate this choice. So they focus on the simplicity for developer and the reliability for the system itself. And the simplicity comes from the limited interop. So it doesn't try to interact with any of your JavaScript libraries. So if you have your jQuery, if you have your any other JavaScript thing that you want to use, you can't. You have a very specific thing that you can use to interact between JavaScript and Elm, and it's like a small hole that you need to specify. This is the hole, and this is going to look like this exactly, and I'm only going to put a square through here, and I'm going to try to put like a round thing there. And that's intentional. It's by design to not bring this whole ecosystem with us. They also integrate all of the tooling. So like in React, where you need to install React, Redux, you need to go install TypeScript and then figure out what you're doing. How do you integrate all this together? By the time you start the project, it's been already a week. So Elm comes with everything, including formatters, compilers, and Redux, and everything included. For reliability, the type system is what kind of makes Elm significantly more reliable than JavaScript. And you can do type system in JavaScript like TypeScript or Flow. But if you ever try to set them up on a big project, you know how much fun is that? Especially when you find this one library which doesn't have typings, and then you end up writing them. Oh, what's that? You're not supposed to be here. And the functional programming part of Elm helps to eliminate all the mutations that you often find in JavaScript code. So like if some function 20 lines deep in the switch statement which just decides to mutate the state somewhere. And if you're not writing React with Redux, it might be very, very annoying. So in Elm, you cannot do this. You don't need the library to force you to not do it. You cannot do this in the language. You cannot mutate anything. So you're forced into different paradigm. It does come with consequences. And the consequence is that the ecosystem is way smaller. So you don't have as many libraries. You don't have this node craziness there, but you also might not find what you want. and you need to develop your own in Elm. And the second, I think, biggest drawback of Elm is that if you go to Stack Overflow and search for Elm, you're probably going to find like 100 times less material and questions than you find for JavaScript. So if you have a question, you might be the only person facing it. That said, if you go to Elm Slack and you ask a question there, usually you get an answer quite easily. I find the community, because it's so small, it kind of tries to support each other in a very nice way. So Elvis is like a plug which is supposed to work somewhere. So I think that Hendrik asked me a question like, what about Redux? Is there a Redux with Elm? Actually, Redux came from Elm, for people who didn't know that. Then Abramov looked at Elm architecture and was like, cool, I want to do the same, but more complicated and not type safe in React. And that's how Redux was created. Funny enough, Dan is trying to remove Redux as much as possible now with all the React hooks and stuff. So let's talk more action, and this is where I have only 5 minutes left. As I promised to Josh, I will finish at 7:20. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to show you me building it. I'm just going to show you the finished project instead. And that's kind of cheating, but seriously. Here we go. Okay, so that's mostly, I guess, relevant for. If you haven't seen an Elm app, it's always starts with the main function. Reminds me of C++. And in the main function, you just need to choose what you're doing. So they have many browser sandboxes, a specific type of application that you're building. So if you're building an application which communicates with like external world, so you want to use some JavaScript interop, you don't use browser sandbox, you use something else. If you're building an application which doesn't have a browser, which Josh was doing, for example, you don't use browser at all. You use a different thing. What that thing is just an environment, a runtime for Elm to know what to run it in. That's it. But when you start the Elm application, you just start with that. You write this one line. You can comment out the rest. If my commenter works, apparently it doesn't. What's happening? Comment. Okay, here we go. Now it works. So Elm instantly gives you like, hey, you don't have this function, you don't have that function, you don't have this function. And as you start defining those functions, you can, like, I don't remember half of the stuff that I need to do. So what I do is just, and this is optional, I'm just going to comment this out for now. I just define a function and I look at the next exception. And you keep going through exceptions. I look at the next compiler error. And you just keep going through the compilers, and when you actually don't have any compilers, your code works. And that's a surprising thing when you go in the browser and just load it, and you're like, I don't understand, but it seems to be working. Something's wrong here. Like, what did I do wrong? So if I uncomment all of this again and show you this working, well, Josh is looking at me very intensely. Come on, man, you need to finish it very fast.
Man, you got 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Oh, thanks, man. I knew it. I knew I have a lot of time. Okay, so I wrote a very simple application. We had a confusion with our students who didn't know how much would I pay per month, because how much is the program and all this stuff. So we would just ask them, like, how many hours can you work on the program, and this is how much you pay for the program in total. So it's a simple slider, like, really nothing very exciting here. And the only value that they kind of change is hours per month. And that's the only value that the user interacts with. Everything else we calculate on the fly. And when you look at Elm, it kind of looks very weird because it doesn't look like React. It doesn't have this JSX. It doesn't have like, where's my HTML? Your HTML is kind of here, but what's strange for me, what was very strange at first, is everything in Elm is a function. So even the HTML elements is a functions. So this div call here is actually a function, which just accepts 2 parameters. And it looks really, really strange, but if you look at it, carefully and ignore that it doesn't have any parentheses, then this is the name of the function, this is the actual first parameter, and this is the second parameter. And every HTML element that you create follows exactly the same approach. So first you put the attributes, and second you put the children of that element. So here what I did is in a kind of, just to demonstrate what you get with Elm is, I put this thing where I can allow them to manually put a number. So I don't know why would they do this, but I just put it for demonstration purposes. So if you put like 20 here, you see everything updates and get 20. However, here's the common exception that you get in React. You put this, and usually you get an exception here. Like if I'm doing it in React, I would get an exception. In Elm, it will force you to figure out what do you want to do. So if I try to get this hours and just put, so this is like your reducer. If you've done React, this is essentially the same as reducer saying, hey, when hours change, I want to grab an hours and do something. So I'm going to just try to assign it. And if you try to assign it, it will actually tell you like, hey, what are you trying to do here? The hours is actually a string, and you have an integer in your model. So it will actually tell you how to fix it by telling you, hey, just use this function. Why are you doing this? So as I said, just follow the compiler. So compiler said this, cool. So I get another exception, which is now says, hey, actually toIn produces maybe. And maybe is this construct which sometimes will have a value and sometimes won't have a value. And it's because the hours is a string. So sometimes you convert it properly, sometimes you don't. And if you wrote a lot of JavaScript code, you probably have seen sometimes people do parsing directly, and there's no try-catch exception or anything. If the value is not integer, bad luck. We get an exception in production. So Elm won't let you do that. You can't, like this won't compile, you can't run this application. Like if I go back, it doesn't even let me see the HTML anymore. So what I need is I need to decide what am I doing with this value now. Am I handling it? Am I just defaulting it? Am I saying to the user, hey, there's an error here, you're trying to type something which is incorrect? And it enforces you to check for all of these edge cases from the get-go instead of delaying them for later when later never happens. So as I had here before, I'm just going to put maybe the default. And I have some default hours there. And I cannot type apparently. Oh yeah, that's one of the things which I find one of the most confusing things about Elm for me was at first is to realize that sometimes you need to wrap it in parentheses because it doesn't understand that this thing is like.
Can you put a dollar sign or something?
Which dollar sign?
After default hours.
You can pipe, but it's not a dollar sign.
Yeah, it's
You can make it look different. I don't remember how with the thing,
Yeah,
but
yeah, it's exactly right.
yeah, but I actually find this syntax fine. But I know there is like this fancy syntax which people use in Elm. So now it compiles again. Ta-da! I was supposed to write this for you, but I didn't want to spend too much time. Okay, do you guys have any questions? Anything weird you want me to do with this app?
How'd you get that slider in there?
The slider is just the input type range. It's supported by standard browsers, and it's a function again. The reason it has this type thing is because type is a registered keyword in Elm, so you can't use type. You need to use type underscore. Same as in React, use class name. Yeah, same shit.
What is your opinion on the CSS frameworks that exist in Elm?
There is this thing called styled elements, and there is sorry, not style elements. What's it called? Elm style, or it got renamed to something else. It's called Elm UI in its latest iteration, I believe. It's from Matthew, whatever his name is, MD Griffith. And what they're actually doing for CSS is really, I find really interesting because they making CSS and layout Elm-like. So they want you to not have runtime exception or like weird layout issues in your CSS either. And you define layouts like, what if you never had to write CSS again? Well, that would be nice, yeah? You define elements like that. And so all of this is compiled. So this background color RGB255, you cannot put any, like this color here, you cannot put not a color. You cannot put like a red with a typo there and then go to your browser and like, why it's not red? Oh yeah, I mistyped red. So all of this, the kind of pushing it inside the compiler, so the compiler can also verify your styles and the layouts, because you can't even put like, can't put row within, just put a column without the row. It will tell you, hey, what are you doing? Like, you can't have this type of element inside.
Can you get auto-completion for that stuff?
Yeah, it works with Elm. It's not an extension on top of the language. It's just a library. Yeah. So this one is really interesting. I haven't used it in this one just because I didn't want to introduce too many stuff. But I find that this work is probably gonna come to React at some point, as Redux did. Cool. Awesome. So next up is Josh. Do we need